I had the honor of having Reid be an investor in a company that John Ellenby and I founded known as Grid Systems way back when, which was probably forgotten by many of you, but we kind of fathered the laptop computer. And Reid was at Institutional Venture Partners, the firm he founded. One of the neat things about Reid is his first venture capital investment was actually done the year I was born, in 1952, which is really cool. Reid has his BS in electrical engineering from Stanford University, and he's had just an amazing career in venture capital. And I'm going to invite Reid to come up, and Reid will introduce Pitch, and then I think Pitch will introduce Reid, and will be totally recursive. Thanks a lot.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. There's some things that I want to sort of use to set the stage tonight, then I'll go into my introduction of Pitch. But I want to read to you a brief excerpt from the Historical Atlas of Santa Clara County, published by Thompson and West in 1876. And that was a few years ago. As a matter of fact, but it underscores a point. And this is talking about what it was like in 1846. Pio Pico, who was the Mexican governor of California in 1846, hated the Americans with true Mexican cordiality. I love that phrase. The grounds of his hatred, which he enumerated in May of that year, 1846, in his address to the Departmental Assembly. Now, this was in San Jose, which is just down the road a ways. He said, "We find ourselves threatened by hordes of Yankee immigrants who have already begun to flock into our country and whose progress we cannot arrest. Already have the wagons of that perfidious people crossed the entire continent, scaled the almost inaccessible summits of the Sierra Nevada, and penetrated the fruitful valley of Sacramento. What that astonishing people will next undertake, I cannot say, but in whatever enterprise they embark, they will be sure to be successful. Already these adventurous voyagers, spreading themselves over a country that seems to suit their tastes, are cultivating farms, establishing vineyards, erecting sawmills, sawing up lumber, and doing 1,000 other things that seem natural to them." Now, I think that is a wonderful description of entrepreneurship, adventurous entrepreneurship, to be sure. But I think that what it means is that there is a history of innovation and entrepreneurship that goes back a long, long way to the very roots of the history of this particular part of the world. And let me have a show of hands. How many of you were born in California? How many of you were not born in California? So you see, you have come to join that horde of Yankee immigrants, and are doing all sorts of wondrous things, and the wondrous things still go on.
Reid, quite a few of those hands weren't from Yankees, though.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Nowadays.
Good point. Well, immigrants. We'll thank you, Pitch. We're going to now I have to introduce you. I'll keep that in mind while I introduce you. Pitch Johnson, I got a bunch of stuff from his office. I mean, they really put out quite a bunch of stuff on you. But and one of the things that they sent me, it starts off saying, Pitch Johnson is considered by many to be the dean of venture capital. Now, I can think of at least a half a dozen people who would disagree with that statement, but nevertheless,
including me.
So it's, but he has probably done more to teach the process of venture capital to other people than anybody else in our industry. He's assumed the role of ambassador of venture capital. I should also tell you that Pitch is a very accomplished private pilot. He flies his own jet to Europe probably 5 or 6 times a year, 4 or 5 or 6 times a year. And private pilots that want to fly fancy airplanes will do almost anything to end up with a business reason for flying. So it's that's true, isn't it? It's always been true. And so at any rate, he has been, in addition to his teachings at Stanford, where he has taught a course on venture capital for 12 years, and where he's still active on a number of Stanford boards and committees. In addition to that, he has, in conjunction with a bank in the Netherlands and some entrepreneurs from the Polish, Czech, and Slovak republics, started a venture firm called European Renaissance Capital to invest and assist new and young companies in Poland, the Czech republics, and the Czech and Slovak republics. He's also started firms down in well, he's an advisor to a firm in Russia. He's started one down in New Zealand, and there isn't any place in the world that Pitch can't fly and claim with impunity that he is on a business trip. So, but he's also been in the venture capital business for a long, long time. He and Bill Draper started Draper and Johnson over 40 years ago, and then after a very successful run at that, he left to, in effect, become an independent venture capitalist at Asset Management. Pitch is the one who caused this chart to be, it's an eye chart, and it really requires a magnifying glass to get all the information out of it. But he caused that chart to be created. And it stops in 1983. Not that venture capital stopped in 1983, not at all. But at any rate, they did that chart. You could not do that today. It would have to go, the chart would have to extend down through the floor and into the space below, probably reaching there are so many firms and so many, there have been so many reorganizations and reconfigurations of so many firms that it would be an impossible thing to do. But at one stage of the game in the early 80s, that chart embodied essentially 100% of the West Coast venture capital industry. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get started with whatever remarks you want.
When do I introduce you?
You can do that now or after the presentation's over.
Well, I was kind of relieved because the last time Reid introduced me, he said, this is Pitch Johnson. He's a legend in his own mind. So I'll probably have to be kinder than I would have been had you repeated that. Well, I think I will. There's a couple things I wanted to say. It was kind of amusing when I thought I'd sit down and jot down the subjects I wanted to cover. You know how you tell people what you're going to tell them, then you tell them. Well, when I got the subjects jotted down, there's too many subjects to do anything but mention the subjects. But so I'll just go down what I think some things that might be interesting to say. I know the group is only partly venture capitalists. Many engineers, pioneer engineers, people in the computer business. It's what I had to say is not particularly devoted to venture capital, but there's a couple of things I wanted to say. First of all, what's going on here in terms of people gathering and understanding that technological change has fostered businesses like Sun Microsystems is really nothing new. If you want to go back very far, of course, the word venture has to do with sailing forth, going out, and of course that's exactly what people have been doing as long as mankind could leave town and go try to trade. So won't go back that far, but I think it's sometimes when I'm thirsty and I'm trying to win a drink, I'll ask someone, although it's a sucker bet, can you come within 20 years of the time the first wireless deal was made, which involved a Stanford faculty member and a graduate student starting a company together. And I won't even bother to mystify you. The year was 1906, when Federal Radio was formed, which later became Mackay Radio, with I can't name their names, but a Stanford professor and a Stanford graduate student. So what's been going on has been going on for a long time in terms of people in academic life and business life coming together, and backers as well, to form companies. I might just mention, getting back to technology, that while we are living around things, if you want to be simplifying about it, opportunities created by the transistor, in terms of piece of science, and by discovery of DNA and the way DNA operates. Those two discoveries have driven the lives of most of us one way or the other. But starting after the Industrial Revolution, there really were important technologies that caused businesses to be formed. You know them, of course, so I won't spend long on them, but I think the steam engine, James Watt, he had a deal. James Watt and his partner patented the steam engine, which was used first to lift water out of mines, and they got £1 per year per horsepower. And that was real money in those days, and it was a business. The steam engine was not merely a scientific invention, it was an entrepreneurial deal which James Watt cooked up. Then some other things came along, the metal refining.
Watt's idea of the separate condenser was what really put them,
that's right,
gave them the innovative edge.
Exactly right, Reid. Before that, what they did was they would fill a cylinder with steam, and there'd be a piston at the top. Then they'd squirt water on the cylinder, and of course the steam would condense, and the pressure would drop to nothing, and the air pressure would drive the cylinder, drive the piston down. Of course, every bit of that heat was wasted, and it was almost impossible to do that economically. So as Reid was pointing out, the ability to cycle that steam back, using part of the energy to get it back and to condense it elsewhere, so you didn't lose the heat, was key to what Watt did. But metal refining, the ability to get refractories and raise metals to high temperatures, while people had smelted things forever, the ability to do it en masse and build blast furnaces and the Bessemer converters and those things came along in that century. And then many mining technologies, and the one while brewing had been coming along for a long time, the important one of distillation came along also in the Industrial Revolution, so that the people who could only drink beer before could now drink gin, and that became important as well. I just will mention some of these because we are living around technology, but people did then as well, and they were taking advantage of entrepreneurial opportunities to build businesses. And the people that take science and technology from laboratories to customers to people who can use them is the job of business. Those are businessmen and women. So we are enablers in that sense of the word, leaving venture capitalists out of it for the moment. By the way, I just mentioned a terrific book about this phase of entrepreneurial life in the Industrial Revolution. It's called The Visible Hand. It's about how the managements organize themselves to take advantage of technological change rather than just having millions of little individual businesses. I don't know that it's so exciting, but if you ever want to feel what it's like to have lived in the entrepreneurial society of the 19th century, that would be it. But what has changed, and what's been is so much different now, is the pace of change. When you really think about it, going back to those people sailing forth in Venice, or even before that, things changed every 100 years, something would happen. But the rate of change, those of everybody here is an engineer practically, so the first derivative was pretty good size, but the first derivative got bigger and bigger, so the second derivative was positive, and I can't go on beyond that to figure out how positive the various derivatives were, but things are moving really fast compared to what they were. And so the way in which our society and our century differs is how fast things have changed. Somebody was saying, you go downstairs, 20 years old, something, you look at that and say, God, is that really old-fashioned? That was 20 years ago. Well, think some guy living in, you just compare that to what 20 years was nothing to somebody even 100 years ago in terms of changes of technology. I want to mention venture capital because it's existed too for a long time, but it got organized and got named about 1944 or 45, just at the conclusion, near the conclusion of World War II, by a Harvard Business School professor who decided that there was a kind of a business that was not just investing, but it was investing in brand new companies, ventures that is, providing capital for them, and as it evolved, providing help as well. So the venture capital got going by name back in the 50s, but it got going pretty with the number of people participating in the 60s. I will just walk over to that chart for a moment. So this chart goes back to 58, and you can see how this curve even, this is the number of firms started every year, and so the more you see, the more are started. So you can see a few started yearly, and then a lot, and then a lot, and then a lot. If we go on past there, as Reid said, it would go on down in the basement. But these are timelines of when companies started. And you can just see this curve indicating how many companies were started per year. It began to be a lot. In the early 60s, Reid and I and some other guys belonged to something called the Western Association of Small Business
Investment. Well, now, wait a minute. Hold on for just a minute.
Okay, I'm holding on.
Hold on for a minute, because you started pretty well there, Pitch. You know, talking about the end of the war in the late 40s. I mean, the mid 40s, 44, yeah. 45. I think 46 was when George Dorio actually formed
the first
American Research and Development Company in Boston.
I thought if I mentioned too much about Harvard Business School, it would upset you.
No. I think you got to give Dorio credit for having started it.
I do.
And he got AR&D was financed by the Rosenwald family out of Chicago, which were important investors in Sears Roebuck, and by the John Hancock Life Insurance Company. So John Hancock was way ahead of the curve as what I would call orthodox institutions investing in venture capital. Don't leave AR&D quite so quickly, because they had some interesting and some other not so interesting investments. One of their not so interesting investments was in a deveined shrimp company. Do you remember that one? You know,
no, I missed that one.
Oh, well, thank God for that. Well, they put a lot of money into a process for deveining shrimp, and it didn't work out so well. But on the other hand, the advantage of being diversified, they did hit the jackpot with digital equipment, where they saw a $77,000 investment in digital equipment grow to $400 million. And so that sort of got everybody's attention, and really, you know, there is some potential to this business called venture capital.
Yeah, there were a few early people you could call venture capitalists, General Dorio being the one, and because I went to Harvard Business School, not Stanford Business School, I was able to take a course from General Dorio, it turned out. And but he talked about other stuff, most of which I really didn't understand. But I remember, this is literally what he said. He says, "Never trust a man who wears a bow tie." But, however, I've trusted this man for a long time, and I've never been disappointed, except during his introductions and interruptions. But leaping ahead to the 1960s, I see Reid had those notes there. What he was worried about was my talking about something he was going to talk about, but he covered it pretty well. So anyway, there were 12 members of our group. That was it. The whole venture capital community of the Bay Area was about 12 people. And we began to develop, and this isn't a venture capital meeting, so I'll just go on a bit longer about venture capital, and that is that the techniques that we all take for granted now, really heavy, long-winded, if you want to call it that, or very thorough checkouts where you make dozens of phone calls, you check out people and markets and all that stuff, that was not anything new, but the Darwinian system of bad deals and survival caused us all to learn a lot about checking things out thoroughly and not making assumptions or not believing everything that somebody told us. Another, the ways in which we became more and more involved in companies. Not so much, it's a delicate balance we eventually worked out. Reid and I were several deals together. How influential should you be in the operations of a company? When it comes to the word operations, not very. When it comes to the word planning, policy, hiring key people, the answer is you should become pretty involved. So venture capital can be defined in the United States as a business in which people invest money for sure. They invest their time and their energy and their stomach lining in companies. And there's one other characteristic which this gentleman has in spades, and that is zeal. If you want to be a venture capitalist and you want to make companies succeed, you put more than your brains and your money in them. You have to have some of that entrepreneurial zeal that the entrepreneurs have. And they've got to feel like you're not only some partner somewhere, but someone who's with them and is excited and thrilled when you succeed and hurts when you fail. People have to believe that you're right with them there. That becomes tough too, because you get too involved and you don't know when the time comes to not keep on going. So there's a very multi-faceted and a big equation that you have to solve. But I think what's happened lately, and I will skip ahead, just to show you scope, I'd like to say a couple more things about venture capital. If you'll give me a little poetic license, in the 60s, tens of millions of dollars in the United States were invested in venture capital. In the 70s, it was hundreds of millions. I'm talking about the total money, like those people you mentioned, Reid, who put money into venture funds. And the fact that ARD had some successes, as did the Rockefeller family, as did the Phipps family, and some others, made people believe, gee, maybe some money can be made in an organized way. So the Rockefellers helped set up Draper, Gaither, and Anderson out here in '62, and there were some successes. So the thing, kind of, again, with one of those curves of unknown shape, except that it's exponential, the business built and built. So in the 70s, hundreds of millions of dollars came from investors into venture capital. In the 80s, because of some tax law changes and some additional fame, a few $billion per year came into the business. In the 90s, it was tens of billions of dollars per year invested in. So the natural assumption is, wouldn't it be hundreds of billions in the Audis? Well, the answer, as we all know, is no. Although in 1999, on the order of $96 billion was put into venture capital. So it's now a big business. It's going to stay big, and it needs to be differentiated from private equity by the involvement which these venture capitalists have in companies. So it's I would say permanent, if anything is permanent part of the American financial scene. I will quote our competitor and friend Tom Perkins, who said it's the pilot light of American business. I think that's not a bad, not a bad metaphor. I have some other stuff I wanted to say, Reid, but I thought I might give you a chance. Although you've taken part of your chance already, to think about it. But let me introduce Reid a little bit. I didn't do any homework at all on Reid because I don't need to. Reid was a Stanford ME, a California-born person from Lake County.
Double E.
But I didn't say ME. I'm not finished with that part of the introduction.
Okay.
But he's California-born, grew up around here.
San Francisco.
Went down to Thatcher to school. Went to Stanford. Was an ME.
No, double E.
Did I say ME? Double E.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. He was a double E.
You've always said I should have been an ME.
Maybe you were smart enough. I don't know why you didn't. So, but Reid served his country in the Navy for a few years, and that's why he has a couple years advantage on me in age. But if you want to call that advantage, but he then we graduated at the same time, and I went off to Harvard Business School. Reid went to Stanford Business School. And I had a real job for a while. Reid had a real job for a while. I worked in a steel mill. What did you do for a real job for a while?
I worked for an insurance company. It wasn't really a real job.
Oh, I thought you had.
No,
you worked right away? Did you go to work? I didn't know that.
6 months out of school, I went to work for Fireman's Fund.
Okay, well, anyway, Reid then, because Fireman's Funds wanted to do some deals, Reid became their venture capitalist, and I'll let him describe, which I'm sure he will, some of the highlights and lowlights of that, but we all have them. But Reid, why don't you take over for a while and tell us some of the stuff you wanted to tell us.
Give you a rest, all right? Okay.
That's good, yeah. Then I'll just rest here.
Well, I think that we were going to try and look at some of the what was going on in the early days that as this this whole experience began to build here on the San Francisco Peninsula. It is hard to realize today how small this industry was and how small the high-tech industry was right after World War II. Right after World War II, Hewlett-Packard, which had really gotten its start during the war by making audio oscillators. There was a Hewlett-Packard audio oscillator on every major ship in the Navy, and that got them going. And after the war was over and those contracts were canceled, they let people go and cut back and thought that it's all over. But there were, when I got out of school in the 50s, the early 50s, there were no publicly traded high-tech companies on the peninsula. None. Ampex came along in about 55 or 6. Litton Industries was a leveraged buyout of Charlie Litton's old glass-blowing lathe company up in San Carlos. Itel McCullough was made vacuum tubes in San Bruno, right there where the road crossed the railroad tracks, and every time they decided to use a new gas in the vacuum tube, they'd string another pipe through the facility, and pipes kept getting lower and lower and lower and lower as today an OSHA compliance officer would go absolutely bonkers in that old iMac plant. Varian Associates got its start making plystron tubes, and Varian has to qualify as probably the most socialistic of all of the capitalistic companies on the peninsula. For a long, long time, they wouldn't let anybody own the stock except employees, which was a pretty good deal. But Hewlett-Packard came along much later, and I think the actual my mind is I think it came public in 1957. If I'm wrong, somebody can correct me. But I do know this, that it came public, and when it came public, they sold 10% of the company. The entire IPO of Hewlett-Packard was represented 10% of the company, and they sold it for $4.8 million. $4.8 million in 1957, and the whole company was worth $48 million by that calculation. I know that both Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard gave a lot of stock to Stanford. Dave Packard at that time was on the Stanford Board of Trustees, said the stock is overpriced, you ought to sell it. They sold it, and if Stanford hadn't sold their HP stock at that time, they'd have one of the largest endowments of any institution in the world. It'd be just incredible. But so that shows you that people don't always have the kind of vision you think they might. Davis and Rock was a firm started by Tommy Davis, who both Pitch and I knew well, and Arthur Rock, who I hope still know well. And I think in many respects, Arthur Rock is the one who if I had to pick out one venture capitalist who was my hero, it would be Arthur Rock, because of the way he's handled himself. The reason they started Davis and Rock was I was talking to Tommy Davis about starting a venture capital company, and we couldn't decide whether we would call it Davis Dennis or Dennis Davis. And so he finally got disgusted and went off and found Arthur Rock so he could make it clear that it would be Davis and Rock. They started with $3 million in 1962, and 7 years later they distributed $86 million worth of securities to their partners. Their big hits were Scientific Data Systems, which they sold to Xerox, and thank God that they did, because it would have gone broke if they hadn't, and Teledyne. But they really clearly showed to outside investors, this is in the early 60s, that there was money to be made in this field. Later in the 60s, we had the whole movement of the small business investment companies, which you may recall. But that got a lot of additional people. Did somebody turn up the mic, or am I doing something different? At any rate, the SBICs again broadened the popularization of this industry. And when I was still at Fireman's Fund Insurance Company then, and we made, at that time, Allstate Insurance was about the only major institution then that as part of its standard business practice was doing what we would now classify as venture capital investments, and that was largely because of Ned Heiser, who was in charge of their investment operation. But Allstate was, again, as they've been in other fields, they were certainly ahead of the curve in the venture business.
Reid, let me, while you're on the subject, let me describe the SBIC program because it was very important. In 1958, the government, the Congress, I should say, in a rare burst of wisdom, decided that larger businesses were dominating the society too much, and it was very difficult. There was not enough competition coming from smaller businesses. You can argue whether they needed to do this because maybe the competition would have happened anyway, but what they chose to do was to pass an act called the Small Business Investment Act of '58, and the basic rules of the game were if you could put together $150,000 of private capital, they would lend you to complete your capital, because the minimum capital was $300,000, another $150,000 under some long-term basis, and then they'd lend you 4 times that to start a company which would invest in small businesses that they were defined. It had to be under a certain size. You couldn't sell alcohol, couldn't be in the radio business, and some other restrictions. But Bill Draper and I both worked for the same steel company, although he came out early. I got in the business because of that law, because I was able to scrape some money together from my steel mill job and some other sources, and so did Bill. So we were able to get our minimum capital, get going then. And the biggest deal you could make if your capital was $300,000 was $60,000. So we made a number of $60,000 investments, some of which were pretty good, a couple of which were not so good. But I was just sort of reinforcing Reid's point that it was a little business thing. It was just the size of investments were small. You could call up anybody, even Reid, and get in a deal if you heard about it. And it was a very collegial, some people might say monopolistic, but it was one thing started then I might mention. Handshakes were good, and handshakes are good now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the characteristics of probably many other businesses, but I've never given a thought, at least with the old guard, about whether a phone call meant what it was supposed to mean. There was some slippage in the late 90s when the money got big and the temptations got large, but the basic hardcore venture capitalists never left this tradition of integrity, trustworthiness, and being good for your word. But I wanted to just talk about the SBICs because they got a lot of people going in the business. It was pretty successful after a couple of false starts, and I'd say there's a cadre of people, at least of our vintage, although not necessarily Reid himself.
Yeah, come on.
No, I was speaking of the video. I was speaking of the fact you didn't ever have an SBIC, did you?
No.
So I meant that a lot of us, though, got started through the SBIC program, and there's a cadre of people who represent, not so much now, but of the little bit older guard who got in this place through an important piece of government action. Some people say, well, the government doesn't have to do anything. They probably did this one right.
That really does underscore again how small this whole process was at the time, because during the 50s, I was probably involved in starting something like 25 companies as a sidelight while I was working at Fireman's Fund, and Bill Bowes and Bill Bowes and John Bryan were at Blythe and Company, an investment banking firm in San Francisco, and Bill Edwards was at a company called Lionel D. Eady that was an investment counsel firm. And because I was, when I went to work on Montgomery Street, I was about the only young person who had a degree in EE, and so if anybody came across some entrepreneur with a black box where this went in and that came out and they didn't have the slightest idea what it did, they'd tell them to come see me. And we had a group of 5 or 6 of us. If any one of the group sort of liked the cut of the entrepreneur's jib, he'd call the group. We were all fairly young people on the street then, and we'd get together at one of the restaurants downtown, Sam's or Jack's or something like that, have lunch with this poor guy. We ate while he told us his story, and so he didn't get much to eat, but at any rate, and then after lunch, we'd literally excuse him and, would you mind going out and standing on the street outside the front door while we talk about this for a few minutes? And we would literally talk around the table for 8 or 10 or 12 minutes and decide whether we wanted to do the deal or not. It was just like that. And then we'd go out and tell him the good news. And
kind of like Donald Trump in The Apprentice.
Well, you must have a lot of time if you can watch things like that. time on your hands. But at any rate, and we at that stage of the game, I'd made some money in Ampex, so I could invest $10,000 or $15,000 at a crack. Both Brian and Edwards had some inherited money, and they were big spenders. They would invest $30,000 at a crack, and we'd literally around the table could come up with 80 or 90 or 100 or maybe $120,000, and and during the middle of the 50s, those 25 companies that we started here on the peninsula all took somewhere between $200,000 to $250,000 to $300,000 to initial capital to get them going. And that's all it took. And we'd go out and tell the entrepreneur, well, we've got roughly $100,000 raised. Give us 10 days and we'll have the rest raised. We'd all go back to our offices, make 3 or 4 phone calls, and put a syndicate together. And you know, don't ask me any questions about what it does, but we think it looks pretty good, and the other guys all agree that it looks good, so send us a check. And we had a whole bunch of followers that would do that. We started the medical device division of Smith, Klein and French that way up here on the Stanford campus. And and we started, as I say, about 25 companies that way. Of the 25, 18 of them were outstanding successes. There were probably 3 that were real turkeys. I don't want to offend a turkey, but nevertheless, where we lost essentially all of our money, and there were the other 5 in between or 4 in between. We might have gotten most of our money back or some of our money back, but it wasn't worth it. So that takes care of the 50s. Pitch has taken care of the 60s. And in the 70s, this business came close to dying.
In fact, there was a cartoon in the New Yorker of a couple of fat cats sitting in a club in New York, and one was saying to the other, venture capital, whatever happened to venture capital?
Yeah.
And that was close to it. There was a 1972, there was one company went public in May of 1972. It happened to be Coherent Radiation. I was involved with it.
Coherent?
Yeah, Coherent. But there was just very, very few companies going public, and when venture capitalists have no way to get liquid, no way to harvest the investments, let alone the entrepreneurs, why the people don't put money in the business. So the 70s, however, did have hundreds of millions of dollars that came in, but that's nothing, I mean, compared to what we have now, but it was as small as Reid was describing. But
well, in 1974, we started Institutional Venture Associates with Burt McMurtry and Burgess Jameson, and that fund that we raised in 1974 was a $19 million fund. It was the only fund that was raised that was more than $10 million in size, and our $19 million represented about 45% of all of the private venture capital money that was raised out here on the peninsula that year. So when I say that this industry came close to dying in the middle 70s, that's exactly what I meant. And at that stage of the game, the capital gains tax rate had gotten up to the point when you figured in California that you were paying 49 1/8%, I think it was, in total on capital gains, and you only paid 50% on ordinary income. So it was very hard to attract seasoned managers out of their soft and cushy jobs in big companies, and tell them to take the entrepreneurial risk of starting something new.
Well, at the 70s, while venture capital was fading, and there were some really fine companies that were established and got going. Tandem Computers was one. Genentech was one. And so many of you probably started companies of your own. I think Grid got going back in those days too. You mentioned Grid. So there was not a lot of venture capital around, but there was a lot of entrepreneurs around. And one point I'd like to make is
and Glenn Edens mentioned that NBI had started in the early 70s. Isn't that right, Glenn?
Yeah.
NBI. It is not true that that stands for nothing but initials. But
well, it's pretty good initials.
Yeah. No,
but I'd like to just point out that the entrepreneurs are the main show. Those of us in venture capital talk a lot about what venture capital is doing, how important venture capital is, but we're basically enablers. What we're enablers of is the men and women who start companies. Most people cannot start a company with no capital, and some of them need more advice than they think they do, but whatever, people do need venture capital, and the entrepreneurial system works. I just had, and I won't inflict the entire thinking on you, but I just had something published about the parallels between entrepreneurship and democracy. Entrepreneurship will flourish when you have various kinds of freedom. It happens to be economic freedom, but it's closely tied in to personal freedom and to political freedom. And of course, democracy is almost defined as political freedom. So what entrepreneurs are doing, if the environment is there, it's just a natural function for people to want to try to take ideas and build businesses and serve the public. Of course, they're trying to make money, but when it's working right, you can't make money unless you do something useful. You build a good company. And I agree in the late 90s, it looked the other way. It was the number of hits you could get or some other thing. But in the end, the great companies, Hewlett-Packard being our star, our original star around here anyway, set the tone for two entrepreneurs devoting their efforts to building a great company, which they did do. One time when I asked Bill Hewlett to come over and talk to my class in my home, actually, he talked about, it was just a wonderful moment when he just said what he thought. He said, Dave and I never thought about making a lot of money ourselves. We knew we would, but what we were focusing on was building a great company, great for our employees, great for our customers, and eventually he said great for the shareholders. But he said our aims were not, and it was sort of a candid moment. He said, our aims were not to make money ourselves. Of course, they did very nicely, but I have always been impressed by that, is that what we're trying to do as venture capitalists is to assist people to build great companies. And if we keep our eye on that ball and not on some short-term gains or going public quickly or some other false gods, then we know what our business is, and it's building companies.
Pitch, would you follow up that point a little bit by telling me, or telling all of us, you had a conversation with Fidel Castro not so very long. Did this subject come up when you were talking to Fidel, or
I hadn't written that paper. There's a few copies sitting on the table over there, by the way. If anybody wants one on the way out, I'll figure on carrying some home, though. I happened to go to Cuba. I've been pretty active in the biological sciences. This group is, I presume, primarily a computer and information sciences people, but we have our brothers in the biological sciences. So I was invited to go to Cuba by an indirect way around, but to make a long story short, I did get permission to fly my plane. I got permission in one day from the Cubans, but it took me about 6 weeks of lawyering and things to get the State Department to tell the Commerce Department to issue me an export license, which you have to do to fly to Cuba. But I did it partly because I wanted to fly somewhere, and it was definitely a business trip, Reid.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the idea, though, is I was going to speak to the biological community, of which there were two basic, an immunology lab and a genetic engineering lab, and they have some pretty good medicine down there, and some pretty good treatments. So after I spoke to the genetic engineering laboratory, one of the people that was there was Fidelito, who's the son of Fidel. And so the word came in the late afternoon that the Comandante would like to see me, and I naturally included my wife Kathy in that invitation. So we went over there with another couple of people, and we were invited for 10 p.m. So you talked about a conversation. This was not what I would call a conversation, Reid, but for a couple of hours, he was very cordial, went into his office, minimum security, I would say. I speak some Spanish, so I would say we had a perfect interpreter who did not misinterpret anything he said or I said. But what happened was for the first, well, it was nearly 2 hours after normal, polite hellos, he started talking about the revolution, how they'd worked on social justice, what it was like before, and we know it wasn't a very good place before either. It's a terrible place still. But he talked, and he finally, at the end of how bad the United States was to have the blockades and all that stuff that he wanted to talk about, he finally said, I understand you spoke this afternoon to the genetic engineering laboratory. And I said, yes, Mr. President. I didn't call him Comandante. So I said, yes, Mr. President, I did. And he said, what did you tell them? He knew damn good well what I told him by then, by the way. I said, well, I just said that I think one way to make your laboratory more efficient would be to create a company. Even though the government would own all the company to start with, you could commercialize it and sell your products and share the ownership of the company and become part owners and say, like, say 20% of the company and give that to the workers and the executives. And and then if you needed to raise capital, you'd have an entity to raise capital with. You couldn't do it in the United States, but you could do it elsewhere. So he said, well, Mr. Johnson, I've just spent a long time telling you about social justice. And if we were to let people own part of this company, and we might have a situation where some people would make more money and be more wealthy than others, and we've been working 40 years to bring social justice to this country. And I said, well, sir, if everybody lived a lot better, because some people made more money than others, wouldn't that be a form of social justice? And he said, Mr. Johnson, I know those arguments. And that wasn't the end of the conversation, but one of the more interesting parts, for those of you who know Kathy Johnson, know she doesn't stay awake easily. And so after about an hour of the diatribes about the United States, I did spot Kathy's head nodding, as it does often in the first act of an opera. And but she did wake up for that little interchange. And the only thing I'll add about the conversation, because he was perfectly polite, did not look well even back then, Reid. But it was just before that Hermanos al Rescate incident. But at the end, he said, well, Mr. Johnson, I understand you flew your own plane here. I said, yes, Mr. President, I did. He said, you know, I've always wanted to be a pilot. And I just kept myself from saying, well, you know, Comandante, if you wanted to be a pilot, I'm sure you could be one and get your license within 6 weeks. But I somehow didn't say that. But it was it was a very interesting thing. The main thing was to go down and talk to them, but to meet Castro. And I must say, I came home convinced that that's such a weak economy and such a weak place that I am just about sure that our policies, and I can get some arguments about this one, have kept him in power for at least the last 10 years. We just, we could have drowned them in a sea of hamburgers if we'd chosen to.
Well, that was a diversion, but I thought that's a unique experience, and I envy you that experience and that ability to keep your mind facile enough to keep up with them and keep one leg ahead of him.
What did you just say?
Huh?
I don't know what you just said, but okay.
Is it all right? Well, they didn't teach you English at Harvard, I guess. Remedial English, did you take that at Harvard? Okay, well,
I had to take remedial. Never mind.
The best time, I think, and Pitch, you can agree or disagree, but I think the best particular year in which to start a company in this whole area was 1980. 1980 was a fabulous time. They had reduced the capital gains tax in 1978, and then they reduced it again in 1980. And it absolutely let loose a floodgate of managers and very, very experienced people out of all of the major companies up and down the peninsula. And we just happened to start one of our funds in 1980. It was a $22 million fund, which was pretty good size for 1980. And when we raised the money, we told our potential investors that, well, we're a small partnership and we're only going to probably invest in 2 startups because the startups are so time-consuming. We'll invest in early-stage companies, but only 2 raw startups. And then it turned out that the startups that came down the pike in the early part of that year, 1980, were just so compelling that in the next 12 months we invested in 6 startups instead of in 2, and they included a couple of companies like Seagate Technology, which turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to us. And it continues to be a good thing that's happening to a lot of people. That runs up and down, gets in trouble, and they have a leveraged buyout. And but being there in the early days when both Al Shugart and Finus Connor were talking to one another and working together as a team, it was a very, very exciting time. We also started Stratus Computer in 1980, which of the 5 companies that came along to sort of mimic what Tandem was doing in the fault-tolerant computer business, Stratus turned out to be the most successful of those. And to get back to your point about, a handshake works pretty well, we decided we wanted to do the Stratus deal, and we didn't have the fund closed yet. And they had located a building outside of Boston that they wanted to sign the lease on, and they needed the first and last month's rent. And so we borrowed the money before the fund was closed to invest in Stratus so they could go pay their first and last month's rent. And that turned out to be a very good move on our part. And we ended up with a Stratus with all these things were very low priced at the time. LSI Logic was started that year by Wilf Corrigan, and that was one of the higher priced deals that we saw. And Wilf is one of the entrepreneurs who really understood the venture capital business and knew how to play one group of investors against the other in a very, very effective way. And then, of course, he had come from England, so for his second round, he went back to England to raise the money from the unsuspecting English and got a real stud horse price for it. We also invested in Exabyte that year. Exabyte was taking the little recorders from that were made by Sony. It was a little small video recorder, and turning that into a data recorder. And my partners thought I was absolutely crazy, but we did that deal anyway, and it turned out to be a spectacular winner. There have been some. Have you ever had a really bad deal, Pitch?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about them in a minute, but since you mentioned 1980, I got to talk about Amgen.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Short version is started in 1980. Bill Bowes and I were instrumental in the beginnings of it, Bill being a hair before me. And the multiple on it turned out to be 2,685 to 1.
Wow.
So that was my 1980.
Well, that's pretty good. And you took the rest of the year off?
But yes, I think I could talk about some bad deals. I thought we were advised, or Reid advised me, that war stories are fun, and they're fun for the teller, I hope for the listener as well as the person telling them. But I wanted to tell a couple of good ones besides Amgen. Amgen, just to describe it, was really a raw startup, although to give credit to Genentech, they pioneered the idea of having a general purpose genetic engineering company, and they developed some good products. They're still developing them, if you read the paper in the last couple of weeks. But in the case of Amgen, it was simply a hope that a group of scientists, there was no particular market in mind, which is against most of our principles even today, but they had 4 products that they thought might be saleable, that the scientists who were academic guys, who were the first people there, there was an idea of making a bacterium which could eat up oil spills. There was an idea they could make another genetically engineered bacterium which would make a dye, indigo dye, so that Levi's could be made more cheaply. I think that was not the only thing, but that was a very important dye. There was a third one, a chicken growth hormone, but it turned out that it broke down in the gut, so you'd have to inject with a hypodermic needle 50,000 chickens a day, and most farmers shied away from that. So the fourth idea was erythropoietin, which was something you could get a certain kind of cell, Chinese hamster ovary cell, when human genes were put in there to make this erythropoietin, which keeps you from being anemic, to make a long story short. Whatever, a lot of products later, and the hiring of a superb first president, which is probably the most important thing that any company does, if the founder himself, the founders were academic guys. But George Rathman built that company, and 2 successive CEOs have kept it going. So that was by far the most successful company, and certainly I'm still on the board, superannuated though, but I'm getting off next year. But it's been an exciting experience to be involved with and helping guide a company from 0 to 10 billion sales. I mean, that, for somebody, in our business, that's large. Guys in funds that manage other people's money, in women, you have to distribute stock, but I put that particular deal, and didn't manage anybody else. I just put it in a family partnership. So that was a good place for it. And didn't have to sell it, didn't have to do anything, just I sold it over time and for different purposes, but not because I had to distribute it. But it's that was a good one. I think I'd like to talk about a little older company than that, was VisiCorp. I was looking at the pictures out in the lobby of the guys that started Software Arts. VisiCorp had a lot of promise. Got involved in it pretty early. Was run by the technical guy, Dan Filestra, was an excellent man, and Terry Optendijk out of Intel was a strong guy too. And so we we licensed from Software Arts the product VisiCalc, because they did not have a marketing arm, and they struck up a deal with Dan Filestra to distribute Frankston and what's the other guy's name? Bricklin. Yeah, Bricklin and Frankston. Decent and very bright guys, by the way. So we did very, very well. The Apple II, the VisiCalc ran on the Apple II, was the first spreadsheet. People were doing things in a few minutes' time that took endless time before that. And we were doing very nicely, getting ready to go public. But the IBM PC came along about 1980, 81. And for various reasons, partly, I don't know the reasons, but between VisiCorp, I mean, and Software Arts, they didn't get a product out that would run on the IBM PC. So Lotus did, by the way, and cleaned our clock to shorten down the discussion. Two things one might learn from this. When I was trying to get Bob Noyce, a good friend of mine, to invest in this company alongside of Benrock and us and some others, he said, I don't want to invest in a company that doesn't have its own product development. He said, even though you're talking about having your own product development, you're dependent on software arts. And what an insight that was. I didn't see it at the time, but he sure did. And the inability of our management at Software Arts to decide to develop, make a big effort to put, to change the product lines to get on the IBM PC caused, in the end, the failure of that company. So that was a hard lesson. It was an expensive lesson. It was also an expensive lesson in an opportunity missed. Because had we moved quickly on the IBM PC, I think Lotus we would have been given a good run for their money at least. So that was a failure. I want to talk also about a success. Nothing spectacular like Amgen, but satisfying in some long-term, long-distance runner. I was a 400-meter runner, so this isn't a good metaphor. But Boole and Babbage was started in 1967, and Boole and Babbage invented these two guys, Ken Kolitz and David Catch, developed the idea that you could write problem programs, or you could write programs, I'm sorry, system programs that would enable computers to run better. There were two programs that I won't go into too much detail, except to say one made the problem programs run faster, and the other one helped you configure your computer. And this was 90s, actually, at that point, IBM's. So then along came the 360 and OS and DOS, and they developed good products for those. Now, it wasn't the first company to have its products be products themselves that could be sold or licensed, as you always do with software. But it was among the earliest, so we were able to sell these products at first 100,000 a year, then 200,000 a year, getting back to the small numbers. Mm-hmm. And the company built up over a long time, and getting into the network business later, went public and got up to about $350 million sales. And finally, when the CEO recommended it, because we were unable to make acquisitions of our own, we sold out to BMC. But the time between the first investment, 1967, and the merger with BMC was 30 years. Now that's long-term investment, but it was up and down. A couple of the ups and downs, I briefly became CEO there for a couple times, but it was, in the end, it was a success. And even the IRR, if you get down to the math of it, wasn't that bad. Even over the 30th root of something is pretty small, but if it's big enough, it was enough to be worthwhile. So I think I just want to mention one more failure. The number of failures that you have if you're doing a good job is about 1 or 2 out of 10 that actually go down the tubes where you lose all your money or most of it. You usually have about 1 out of 10, you have about 1 barn burner. I'm not suggesting 2,000 to 1, though. I'm just saying that goes 20, 130 to 1 and really makes up for a lot of mistakes. And then maybe 4 or 5 do their standard job of decent returns. 1 or 2 fail, and then we have 1 or 2 we call the living dead. And they just hang in there, soak up the cream, and take up a lot of time. And sometimes the entrepreneur isn't trying hard, or sometimes it's just he's batting his or her head against the wall. But the other failure I want to mention is recent, and we started a company, helped start a company called Talkway. Talkway had a couple of really fine guys, engineers who started it, who you can't fault for sincerity, ability, or product definition. So we made one shot, I won't even go into the detail, that didn't work. It was an advertising ploy to bring advertising to advertising services. But then, rather than give up on it, because there were some good people there, some of the people there developed the idea that you could send video emails to people, and that people would like to be able to send an email with pictures of the grandkids or maybe some little business message on it, or an executive might like to send a video email to all of his employees with a wonderful message. And it made a lot of sense. And so we poured more money into this operation, a lot of it us, other co-investors. But reasons I still don't fully understand, Reid, the public never really got interested in sending video emails. It was easy to get a little camera. You could buy one cheaply through us, or a lot of computers had cameras. But we busted our pick on this deal, and it just never worked. I understand what happened at VisiCorp. I really don't understand, even today, with my wounds that I have from this, both emotional and pride, and certainly money, why this deal didn't work. But the fact was, we misjudged a marketplace in a big way.
Well, in some of these cases, you can be too early, you know, and misjudge your market. You know, it's one of our major failures at IVP was a company called Reference Technology.
Which was it, Reid?
Reference. Reference Technology. There was also Reference Technology Inc. was in another Boulder company, and they took originally the 14-inch video discs from Sony, I believe it was, and tried to make a data recorder out of it. And they had great vision. They could envision the day that you might even, and I just never could get this thing through my head, but you might someday be able to distribute software on little video discs, you know, or on little recorded discs. And we just poured money into it, but we were just too early. You know, and you can be too early on these things. There is an early electronic eye out of an electronic reader developed in the early 1960s by downstairs in the warehouse somewhere, and it's about that tall and that wide, and has 630 individual TI diodes epoxied into the back of the lens, which is a hard way to make a optical reader, and it would read. You had to blow up typewritten print until it was about that high, and scan it across this thing. And Recognition Equipment was a company that, with a group of engineers that loved to solve problems, and the tougher the problem, the more convoluted the solution would be. But nevertheless, they loved to solve problems. And that was an investment that we made back in the early 1960s at Fireman's Fund. And I can't really call it a mistake, because the stock went from $1 to 102, but then it went back to 2, and which I call sort of a tough way to double your money, but nevertheless, and then, you know, the other place that we got mousetrapped in the 90s was by staying too long and thinking there was one more leg on the disk drive business, with something smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and we at IVP set up quite some time ago. We set up a thing called the Lazarus Award. Lazarus was a dog in San Francisco. Bummer and Lazarus were two dogs in San Francisco in the 1860s, who were two of the best ratters in town, and they were memorialized in a cartoon. So we set up the Lazarus Award to be presented the way that it reads, by the general partners of institutional venture partners, in parentheses, on hopefully infrequent occasions to the deadest dogs in each of our portfolios. And unfortunately, Reference Technology, and I could set up this award because I had two of the winners on it. One of them was Reference Technology, and the other one was Ministore, which Ministore just came along too late in the whole spectrum of...
Reid, I thought you were making an Old Testament reference there to Lazarus, the man who rose from the dead.
No, these
stayed down.
These stayed down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, the cartoon that memorializes these two is a cartoon of the funeral of Lazarus, and shows him lowering them into the ground, and they very definitely stayed dead. Do we have time, Glenn, for a couple of questions to the floor, if there are any?
I'm a little shy.
No.
My name is Kat Powell, and I'm a volunteer here at the Computer History Museum.
Yep.
My question is, I would like for you to make a future prediction. With company mergers being the event of the day, like big fish swallowing little fish, such as Oracle swallowing PeopleSoft, what do you predict for the spawning of a new little fish who will become big players?
Okay, so in other words, comments on the future of the industry. You want to take that first? You know, or can we still take little fish and grow them into big fish?
Absolutely.
Yeah, all right.
And right down the block, there's a terribly little fish that's a huge fish right now. It didn't get swallowed.
Microsoft.
No. I was thinking right down there on Movie Boulevard or whatever they call it. I mean,
Oh, you're talking about Google?
I'm thinking of Google. There's
Sure.
a perfect example. We weren't involved in it unhappily, but it is truly a great company. 10 years ago, it was a tiny company, didn't get swallowed, probably didn't want to be swallowed, maybe it couldn't have been swallowed. Maybe Microsoft was asleep, I don't know. But whatever, that's an example in your own neighborhood of and there'll be many. Mergers right now are attractive because it's a little bit harder to go public, but these are endless cycles of public markets opening up and closing, and when public markets are slow, people merge out companies just to get liquid. But I'd have no thought there's a diminution in any long-term sense of the ability to take a young company and grow into a big company.
Okay, we'll take this gentleman who's number 2 now. Go ahead. Sorry to...
A short worm's eye view of the venture capital community, followed by a question. You mentioned 1980 was an excellent time to start a company. I started one, went looking for venture capital. Got no bites. After 8 presentations, I finally took the radical step of starting to wear a coat and tie.
You gave it up, though.
Kept going through 32 presentations, at which point I finally figured it out that we weren't going to get any. We then bootstrapped very painfully and made it after a fashion. Meanwhile, the venture capital community was pouring much money into Me Too disc companies, many of which folded, and megabucks into a company called Trilogy. I eventually figured out that venture capitalists have lunch with each other a lot, and if you haven't gotten a bite early on, you might as well forget about it. My question is, how many pitches should one give before giving up?
Okay, well, let me take that one for a minute. Number one, I think things have changed a lot. I don't think venture capitalists talk to one another as much today as they used to. We used to need each other. We used to put syndicates together. You know, when Measurex started here many, many years ago, they wanted to raise $1,200,000. None of us had ever seen a deal that big, and it just absolutely floored us. And it wasn't until Bessemer Securities came in from New York and said, well, we'll put up $600,000 if you can raise the rest of the money locally, that we actually did that deal. But back in those days, we needed one another. We did deals in syndicates with Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia and all of those firms that are so big now. But you know, I think that it is a much less collegial industry. I'm talking about the venture capital industry today than it used to be, and we don't have lunch with one another and talk that much about our deals. It's our firms have become too big for that. You know, the other thing I have to say is that, you know, it is hard to say no, but please understand that our experience, my experience over all these years, has been that we will typically invest in somewhere between 1.5% and 2.5% of all of the deals we see. That means that you're saying no 97.5% to 98.5% of the time. And it's not a comfortable thing to do. And I guess if I have any thing to sort of fault the current venture capital industry on today is the fact that we used to always make sure that we gave any entrepreneur who would come in to see us, no matter how crazy the idea was, if we made an appointment, we'd give them an hour. And now they're cutting that back to 45 minutes or 40 minutes or something, and then on to the next. And I just don't think that's the right way to treat people. But but you do have to understand that we do have to get very good at saying no. We have to be very polite about it, and I hope in many cases we try to, you know, you can't very well suggest that you go see Pitch Johnson if you just turned the deal down. You know, that's not fun or fair or anything else. So it's a tough business in that regard, and I'm sorry about that, but not every idea gets funded over here. Go ahead, sir.
Following on the first question about opportunities, as you've talked extensively about IT and a little bit about life science and leaving aside some of the obvious things like nanotechnology, what kinds of industries do you think are offering opportunities these days? Maybe a little bit of field of where you've looked or where your partners have looked recently.
Well, in the information sciences, it's got to be extensions of the utilization of the internet. I mean, it sounds like a trite answer, but how, like just the voice over IP is being explored thoroughly, but there's so many aspects of the interconnectedness of the world and the speed with which you can be in touch with anybody with lots of data or lots of voice is a remarkable phenomenon, not fully or not even partially exploited. Not Milton Friedman, but Tom Friedman, that what I think terrific columnist in the New York Times, said we've gone from a vertical to a horizontal society in a few years' time. And he just means that the main focus can now be breadth. So this is a very unspecific answer to your question, but every day, every week, somebody comes up with a new idea about a broad market for the distribution of information or protecting information. I think the whole security area is extremely, not untouched, of course, but undeveloped. How do you protect code words? How do banks protect identities? I mean, there's just, those things are just, there's endless opportunity. So in the information sciences, I think internet-related activities are key. In the biological sciences, specific directed cures for different kinds of cancer are, there's just any number of targets there, and any number of companies can be started as people figure out mechanisms for stopping growth or killing growth of cancerous growth, and how can you take those basic technologies and apply them to multiple cancers. But most companies in the biological sciences now are focused on a specific ailment, and the money and the energy and the market is quite concentrated. That contrasts with when Genentech and Amgen were started, where you started companies in general with the hope you could develop some products. I don't know, Reid, what are some of your favorites?
Well, you hit on a couple of them, but the security area and the software area is certainly one, and we've done quite a bit in software. I think that you know, right now I am terribly I'm discouraged by the speed that our industry is moving on at. It's once again, it's beginning to heat up, and you don't really have as much time to thoughtfully think about some of the things that are being presented to you. And then, so this is not right to your question, but I think that my whole feeling is that we're living in an age where there is an enormous amount, and certainly Google and some of the other search firms have addressed this, but we're living in an age where there is an enormous amount of information available, absolutely enormous amount, and anything that helps you manage that information to get at whatever kernels is that you're trying to get at and manage it in an effective way is going to be an interesting area to invest in. But I think that now we seem to find ourselves in a financial community that is more interested in financial engineering than it is in building companies, and I think we've gotten away from that business of building companies.
I just want to add, I think we can't lose sight of the fact we're company builders, we're not financiers. Finance is part of the venture capital business, but venture capital is not part of finance. We're doing a lot more than what I think of as financial work.
My way of describing it is that venture capital is both a fuel and a lubricant, but the motive power has got to come from the entrepreneurs. So, talking about motive power, we got one right here.
Yeah. First, I wanted to thank you, Pitch, for mentioning as your sad failure story, Personal Software VisiCorp, which I was the first employee of many, many years ago. But I wanted to ask you about extrapolation, because I found it amusing to see your chart and look at the exponential curve. You mentioned the second order derivative early on in your discussion, and wonder what it was like when people discussed it at that time and said, look at this exponential growth, how long can this go on? And it did indeed go on for a great deal more time, and some could even argue that while there was a bizarre spike in the late 90s that has been recovered from, that the growth will continue. Did people think you were absolutely crazy to think it could go further and be exponential for decades to come, or did most people think it was going to fade soon?
The one thing that chart does, it shows the number of companies started. What that chart failed to anticipate or even show is the size of the company, the amount of money involved. I don't know that curve would keep getting, the exponent would stay the same. I think probably the number of companies started varied a lot with the years. This little seminar is called 100 Odd Years of Venture Capital Wisdom. Well, some years are odder than others. And one of the most odd years occurred in the odd years in the late 90s, where tons of money poured into managers who had known nothing about venture capital. I just figure you couldn't miss if you went into internet deals, which became known as dot-com deals. But the answer to your specific question is, I think when this chart was developed by, we didn't know what the answers were going to be. We just made the chart. It just came out that way. My wife did actually the research on that chart, and a wonderful woman named Peggy Burke did the art. It came out nicely.
I like the nice parallel between the Stanford logo and dollar signs, though. It fits.
I'm sorry?
The nice illusion between the Stanford logo and dollar signs.
I think it works well. Whatever. We didn't know. The answer is we didn't know what the curve. It just came out like it was experimental data, and the curve came out that way. So I don't think we were thinking about would that curve. But this is 20 years later. I mean, think of the computers that were being designed in 1983. I mean, they were primitive.
But let me add something here, Pitch. I'd like your view on this, but particularly, I happen to think today we have much too much money in the venture capital industry still, or in the private equity industry still. There's still much too much money. There are not that many. There are not that many good deals to be funded that we need all this money, and I think there are probably still twice as many firms in the private equity business as we need and as will be there 10 years from now.
I differ with Reid on terminology. I don't like to think of venture capital as part of the private equity business. I like to think of it, there is the private equity business and there's venture capital. The fact that, and people do it both ways, I like to keep us separate from those guys because they're doing an important function, but they're not venture capitalists, the guys that I think of as being in private equity.
Well, I can agree with that, but the trouble is that line is getting blurred between the two in the minds of some investors. And there are some investors that think that they're investing in venture capital and they're really investing in financial engineering. I don't know that we've answered your question, but let's go back to this side and we'll try.
I wonder if you might just be able to comment about the changing backgrounds of people who consider themselves venture capitalists. It seems to me that you've got a lot of people out there who are venture capitalists, but they have a lot of different backgrounds. You've got the people who have been in this industry for a while and actually have backed startup companies that they've brought to become market leaders. You've got people who have investment banking backgrounds. You've got people with consulting backgrounds. You've got people with sort of corporate operating backgrounds from big companies. What do you see out there as, in terms of the backgrounds of the venture capitalists as being actually useful to entrepreneurs?
There was an easy answer to your question. It was engineers with MBAs. That was both of us are that, and many people with technical,
maybe beyond the educational background, because you're talking about engineering and
the real job period. I think
right.
Yeah, people. Well, I mean, Reid would have to speak for himself, but I practically assure the same answer. People come to us with a thought about a job, and we want people in our firm, although we're not big and we don't hire a lot of people, who have had operating jobs in companies. People who've had only, and this is a narrow view, and this is just our view. It's the West Coast view, maybe compared to a back East view, but we want people who've actually been out there in an operating company, who know what it's like to make an operating decision, live with the results of the decision, make markets happen, supervise people, pull people together, the whole thing that goes with being in an operating company. So I think there's plenty of good people in our business who have been investment bankers, who have been, Mike Morris, wasn't he a journalist or something? So he's a good venture capitalist. But I still like the idea of the technical education and business experience, perhaps including business school, but a few years of being on the line selling, maybe marketing, engineering, production, those disciplines, to me, help a lot in making venture capital decisions.
I don't think I've never been a fan of taking people out of the investment banking business and making them into venture capitalists, and or trying to. I think investment bankers have been in the business of taking something and selling it to somebody else, and they make money on the transaction, and you end up owning the stock, so to speak, for better or for worse. I'd rather deal with people that have do their investment analysis and always from the point of view of a buyer. I've never been a great fan of people out of a consulting background either, and for our industry. Consultants are wonderful at analyzing things and giving you all of your options and suggesting things, but they can't make decisions. They don't have to make decisions. And most importantly is after they made their presentation to you, they go away, and the management of the company has to make the decision, and the management of the company has to live with that decision, whereas the consultant has gone on to another project and doesn't have to live with the effects of their own decisions. So we've sort of answered your question with a couple of negative approaches to it as to what we don't look for.
But it is changing, but that's still, whether you're technically trained or even formal business training, I still think the idea of having worked in a company that does something is really an important feature, and it's still, on the West Coast, it holds pretty true still.
Okay, we'll take these questions that are still here, and we're almost done. Go ahead, sir.
One of the criticisms of the venture capital industry, at least today, is that you're not really interested in funding businesses with really new ideas, but interested in not being left out of the next new idea.
Yeah.
Do you see that? And is that a new thing?
I don't think that's true at all. I think that I'm supposedly a partner in a firm that only does late stage deals, and or expansion capital at the moment. That's where I am. But I love the startup business, and I am working with one little company called Dust Networks that is making wireless self-configuring networks, and it's very, very exciting, and we don't have a lot of other people doing exactly what we're doing right now. It's a fairly lonely field, and that's fine. Hope it's going to stay that way for quite a while, and we'll do very well. But I think that the worst example of what you're talking about was trying to get on the disk drive bandwagon, where a couple of good examples led by Seagate and some others, really Micropolis and those caused within a matter of a couple of years some 55 disk drive companies to be created, and there wasn't room for that number of companies in that industry, and I think that's a real mistake. Now, I mentioned Stratus following along. There were 5 companies that tried to emulate what Tandem did in terms of fault-tolerant computers. Stratus ended up with the best strategy out of those 5, and it succeeded. But and the others didn't amount to a great deal. But I think that you want to avoid a field that is much too crowded and is sort of, where's the new disk drive company of the week, so to speak. And we certainly try to do that. We'd much rather invest in something that's unique and not follow along in somebody else's footsteps.
Yeah, we're startup guys, and we look for new ideas primarily, starting up things. Unless there's some particular new part of the market you can serve better, some tremendous technology advantage, we'd rather go with somebody who's exploring a new niche or a new idea. Sometimes it doesn't work like Talkway, but sometimes it works great.
This gentleman's been very... Go ahead. You have a short...
Well, I was just going to ask, you see a lot of new firms. You said that there are too many firms. Do you see this kind of, we got to jump on the bandwagon with newer firms rather than the old guard?
Well, now, it depends on whether you're talking about newer firms in the venture capital business or in...
Right, newer firms in the venture capital business.
Well, right now, I don't think there are that many new firms being formed in the venture capital business. I think we got too many of the older firms that were, and I don't mean the really old firms like Pitch's firm or our firm, but in the period 99, 2000, 2001, there were a huge number of new entrants into this business, and they came in just as the bubble was starting to burst. And it's that dislocation. It takes a lot of time to waste that much money. It really does. So it's, it'll get sorted out eventually. Yes, sir. You've been very patient.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your waiting to let me close on this last question here. I noticed that we both have, all of us seem to have the same hair coloring, so we go back a little ways. I wanted to bring your attention to something that we all kind of have a stake in. It's kind of like the invisible 800-pound gorilla. It's really the engine that seems to be driving economy here in the Valley and also VCs. And that 800-pound gorilla is innovation. And I was curious to get your ideas, both of you, with respect to where do you've certainly met a lot of innovators. Where do you think this stuff comes from? How does it get there? And it's kind of a two-part question. The other question is that with regard to the global competition that we're experiencing now, there seems to be a feeling that, here in the Valley, we have a monopoly on innovation in some way. And I would appreciate your comments on that. Do you think that's really true? Where does this stuff come from? Because essentially, this is part of the fuel, part of the engine that's driving our economy here, and so forth.
Okay. Well,
thank you.
We'll both comment on that. I'd like to, and thank you really for bringing us back to the starting point, because the starting point was innovation is nothing new, and that was the subtitle of our presentation tonight. And I think that that is certainly true. It is, I have it on good authority, the first innovator was Adam when he picked up the fig leaf. And people have been innovating ever since. And I don't think it's, you know, I don't know where it comes from. But it's a natural instinct. I used to know someone that, when I was growing up, who said that necessity is the mother of invention. And I think that that is partly true. But I think that as soon as semiconductors and microprocessors get smaller by some significant dimension, there are going to be brand new uses found for whatever, for that combination of the smaller product. And as things get miniaturized, we're going to find new ways to do new things with them. And so the innovation, it's certainly in that cycle goes on. I think certainly in microbiology, it's going to go on and on and on as long as we can keep getting down to smaller and smaller sizes in terms of combinations of things. So, yeah, it's hard to know where that spirit comes from. Many, many years ago, when I was still, I think, well, probably early in college, I met another young man socially up in San Francisco, and we were talking about investment philosophies, and he was my age, and he said, you know, well, Reid, you know, he didn't understand any of these things that I was interested in or trying to do. He said his particular investment objective, above all else, was preservation of capital. And I just felt so sorry for him. You know, I just felt so sorry for him. If for no other reason that he's going to have less to give away sometime, and will never really, you know, Pitch has been an incredible philanthropist, and it's done a lot of good for a lot of people, and he's worked hard in the education field, and he's given away an enormous amount of money. And I think it's that sort of thing is terrific. And so I feel sorry for people who say, boy, I just want to hold on to what I've got, and you know, don't try to challenge me with any new ideas. I don't think innovation is going to go away.
The innovation is technology and new ideas, but another kind of innovation is markets and imagination about markets. The job of entrepreneurs is to take ideas, not necessarily ones they invent, and figure out how can this piece of science, how can this piece of engineering become something that's useful to people. That's an important part of innovation also, so that I don't believe in the right political and social and environmental freedom, if those who want to pick up my paper could read that, that will ever stop in a country with lots of freedom. And it goes with, it's part of democracy, it's part of economic freedom, and innovation is not technology innovation. It's innovation about serving people in different ways, sometimes with technology.
And you will find that people will still do 1,000 other things that seem perfectly natural to them. Thank you.